There are experiences you're having right now that you can't explain to anyone, not because they're mystical or special, but because they only happen at a specific level of consciousness. And if you haven't reached that level, they're literally incomprehensible. Carl Jung documented these experiences throughout his work, the strange, isolating, undeniable shifts that happen when your consciousness expands beyond the collective norm. Things like feeling physically ill around unconscious people, seeing through social performances in real time, losing all interest in conversations that used to engage you, feeling psychologically homeless even when surrounded by people. Most people will never experience these things, not because they're not spiritual enough, but because their consciousness hasn't developed to the threshold where these perceptions become possible. But if you're experiencing them, Jung would say, you're not going crazy. You're becoming conscious. And consciousness comes with experiences that unconscious people literally cannot have. I'm about to walk you through 5 experiences that only happen after psychological awakening. If you're having them, you'll know you're not alone. If you're not, you'll understand why awakened people seem so strange, so distant, so different. Here's what Jung understood that explains everything. Awakening isn't just a shift in beliefs or perspective. It's a fundamental rewiring of how your psyche processes reality. Once that rewiring happens, you don't just think differently, you perceive differently, feel differently, experience reality itself differently. The problem is, you're now perceiving things that other people literally cannot perceive. Not won't perceive, cannot. Their consciousness hasn't developed the structures necessary to register what you're experiencing. So when you try to explain what you're going through, you sound crazy, dramatic, or delusional to anyone still operating at the previous level. Jung experienced this profoundly after his break with Freud and his descent into the unconscious. He would describe his experiences, visions, encounters with archetypal figures, direct perception of unconscious material, and even his closest colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. Not because he had, but because he was experiencing realities their consciousness couldn't access. This is the loneliness of awakening. You're having experiences that prove you're not crazy, but you can't explain them to anyone without sounding crazy. The very thing confirming your sanity to yourself makes you appear insane to others. What Jung documented were specific, consistent experiences that everyone at a certain consciousness level reports, regardless of culture, background, or spiritual tradition. These aren't beliefs or interpretations. They're direct perceptions that become possible once consciousness reaches a developmental threshold. Jung discovered that awakened people develop what he called energetic sensitivity. They can physically feel the unconscious material that other people are carrying, not as a vague sense, but as actual somatic symptoms. Nausea, headaches, exhaustion, tension. Your body reacts to unconscious energy like an immune system reacting to toxins. Here's what's actually happening. Unconscious people are constantly leaking psychic material, repressed emotions, denied shadow, unprocessed trauma, projected content. When you're unconscious too, you don't notice because you're leaking the same material. But once you become conscious and integrate your shadow, your system becomes clean, and clean systems can feel contamination that dirty systems are numb to. One of Jung's patients described it perfectly. I walked into a family gathering and immediately felt nauseous. Not nervous, physically sick. Everyone was performing happiness while seething with resentment underneath. I could feel the gap between their personas and their shadows. It was like standing in a room full of toxic gas that only I could smell. I left after 20 minutes and the nausea disappeared instantly. She wasn't being oversensitive or dramatic. Her consciousness had developed to the point where she could viscerally feel psychic incongruence, the energetic dissonance between what people present and what they're repressing. Unconscious people can't feel this because they're creating the same dissonance themselves. Jung noticed this in himself after his individuation. Being in crowds became physically unbearable, not from social anxiety, but from energetic overload. He could feel everyone's unconscious material swirling. Projections, repressions, shadow content, complexes, creating a psychic storm that his conscious system registered as physical assault. This phenomenon isn't supernatural, it's psychological sensitivity developed to an extreme degree. Just as some people can taste subtle flavors others miss, awakened consciousness can perceive psychological atmospheres that most people are completely numb to. Your nervous system has become calibrated to detect incongruence, repression, and shadow material in the energetic field around you. This is why awakened people suddenly can't tolerate environments they used to navigate easily. It's not that they became weak or antisocial, it's that their consciousness developed the sensitivity to feel what was always there, but was previously imperceptible. But here's what makes this hard. When you tell people, "I can't be around unconscious energy," they think you're being judgmental or precious. They can't understand that you're describing a literal physical experience, not a preference. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's colorblind. They can't perceive what you're perceiving, so they assume you're making it up. This is one of the most isolating experiences of awakening. Your body becomes a tuning fork for unconscious material, and suddenly most environments become physically unbearable. You're not choosing to withdraw from people. Your nervous system is forcing you to, because it can feel what your previous level of consciousness was numb to. Jung identified another experience unique to awakened consciousness. You lose the ability to participate in social theater because you can see through everyone's performance in real time, not as judgment, but as direct perception. You see the persona, the shadow beneath it, the complex driving it, the projection being cast, all simultaneously, all immediately. Before awakening, you participated in social interaction through your own persona, unconsciously. You'd meet someone, both perform your personas, and interact through these masks. It felt normal because neither of you knew you were performing. But once you individuate and integrate your shadow, your persona becomes transparent to you. And once you can see through your own persona, you automatically see through everyone else's. This creates an impossible situation. Every social interaction becomes a play where you're the only one aware it's a play. You're watching people perform roles they think are their authentic selves. You can see what they're avoiding, what they're compensating for, what shadow material is driving their behavior. Your consciousness has developed pattern recognition for psychological defense mechanisms. You see the micro-expressions that betray what the words deny. You feel the energetic incongruence between what someone says and what they actually feel. You recognize the archetypal patterns playing out beneath the individual's conscious awareness. Jung experienced this acutely after his individuation. He found most social interaction exhausting and false. He could see everyone's complexes operating, their projections flying, their personas performing. He wasn't judging them. He was simply aware of dynamics they were unconscious of. And that awareness made genuine connection rare and precious when it did occur. This perceptual capacity develops because individuation requires you to dismantle your own persona and integrate your shadow. In that process, you become intimately familiar with how personas are constructed and what shadows look like when projected. Once you know these mechanisms in yourself, you can't help but recognize them in others. This is why awakened people often seem distant or aloof. They're not being antisocial. They're navigating a reality where they can see the psychological machinery operating beneath social surfaces. And they're trying to decide how to be authentic in environments built entirely on performance. But here's the painful part. You can't point out what you're seeing without seeming insulting. If you tell someone, "I can see you're performing right now," they experience it as attack, not observation. If you name someone's projection, they feel exposed, not helped. So you're stuck seeing truths you can't speak, watching dynamics you can't address, aware of what everyone else is unconscious of. This creates profound loneliness. You're the only one watching the real movie while everyone else is absorbed in the scripted performance. And you can't explain what you're seeing without breaking social contracts that require everyone to pretend the performance is real. Jung documented another universal experience of awakening. You suddenly lose all tolerance for surface conversation, not from snobbery, but from genuine incapacity. Once your consciousness has accessed depth, surface interaction feels like psychological suffocation. Here's what actually happens. Awakened people operate from multiple levels of awareness simultaneously. They're aware of content, context, subtext, unconscious material, archetypal patterns, and deeper meaning, all at once. When they enter conversations that only operate on the content level, it's like being a musician who can hear every note in a symphony forced to listen to someone bang on one key repeatedly. Before individuation, you could engage in small talk because that's the level you were operating from. You'd discuss weather, sports, gossip, surface events, and it felt like real communication because your consciousness wasn't perceiving the deeper levels. But once you develop depth perception, surface content becomes visible as avoidance of what's actually happening. One woman described the shift. "I went to a dinner party where everyone was discussing Netflix shows and vacation plans. Before my awakening, I would have enjoyed this. Now, I could feel the massive amount of unconscious material in the room. One person's marriage dying, another's existential crisis, someone's addiction, someone else's depression, and we're all performing normalcy by discussing television. I felt like I was suffocating. Not because I'm too serious, but because the gap between what we were discussing and what was actually present became psychologically unbearable." She wasn't judging the people or the conversation. She was describing the experience of seeing multiple levels simultaneously, while being forced to interact on only the surface level. It's like knowing everyone in the room is drowning, but you're all required to pretend you're having a pool party. Jung found this so challenging that he increasingly withdrew from social situations that required surface interaction, not from antisocial tendencies, but from the psychological cost of constantly operating at a surface level when his consciousness was perceiving depths. It wasn't sustainable to dim his awareness for hours just to maintain social belonging. What makes this particularly difficult is that you can simultaneously perceive what's being discussed and what's being avoided. Someone talks about their vacation while you can feel their marriage crumbling. Someone discusses work challenges while you perceive their existential crisis. You're having two conversations simultaneously, the one happening on the surface and the one that's actually true underneath. This is why awakened people seem difficult or intense. They're not trying to be deep. They can't help perceiving depth. And once you see beneath surface, participating in conversations that deliberately avoid depth feels like psychological violence. You're being asked to pretend you don't see what you see, don't know what you know, don't feel what you feel. But here's the excruciating part. Most people need surface conversation. It's how they maintain psychological stability. Discussing depths they haven't integrated yet would destabilize them. So, they're not avoiding depth from stupidity. They're avoiding it from psychological necessity. But you can't explain this without sounding condescending, and you can't participate without betraying your consciousness. So, you face an impossible choice. Engage in surface conversation and feel like you're dying inside, or refuse and seem cold, difficult, or arrogant. Which is why awakened people increasingly choose solitude over shallow connection. If you're recognizing these experiences, feeling physically sick around unconscious energy, seeing through everyone's performance, unable to tolerate shallow conversation, you're not becoming difficult. You're becoming conscious. And consciousness perceives what unconsciousness cannot. Before we explore the final two experiences that confirm you've crossed the threshold, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these next two experiences explain why awakened people feel homeless in the world, and why that homelessness might be exactly where you need to be. Jung identified what he called the homelessness of individuation. Awakened people lose their psychological home in collective consciousness and haven't yet found home in their individual truth. You exist in a gap between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Here's what creates this. Before awakening, your identity, meaning, and belonging came from the collective. You knew who you were through your roles, your beliefs, your tribe. Your psyche was housed in collective structures. Then individuation dismantles those structures. You can't derive identity from roles anymore because you've seen through the persona. You can't believe collective narratives because you've developed critical consciousness. You can't belong to tribes because you've transcended groupthink. But you haven't yet fully established home in your individual self. So you exist in homelessness, exiled from collective belonging, not yet rooted in authentic selfhood. You're psychologically between worlds. This homelessness manifests in practical, painful ways. You can't answer, "Who are you?" with the answers that used to work. Your profession doesn't define you anymore. Your beliefs don't organize your identity. Your relationships don't tell you who you are. All the external markers that once housed your sense of self have become irrelevant, but you haven't yet fully developed the internal sense of self to replace them. Jung experienced this deeply after his break with Freud. He lost his psychological home in the psychoanalytic community, his identity as Freud's successor, his belonging in the intellectual tribe. He spent years in what he called creative illness. What looked like madness from outside was actually him wandering the void between collective belonging and individual truth. What he discovered: you can't move directly from collective identity to individual self. There has to be a gap, a void, a period of not belonging. That void is where transformation happens. If you immediately found a new home, you just build another false structure. The homelessness forces you to discover your authentic ground, the sense of self that doesn't depend on external confirmation. But it's excruciating while you're in it. You look at people still housed in collective consciousness, comfortable in their beliefs, secure in their roles, belonging to their tribes, and part of you envies them. They have home. You don't. They have certainty. You live in questions. They belong. You're in exile. This is why awakened people often seem lost or aimless. They're not lost. They're homeless. And that homelessness is developmental, not pathological. They're in the necessary void between who they were taught to be and who they actually are. But here's the hope Jung offers. Homelessness is temporary. As you continue individuating, you start finding home in yourself, not in roles, beliefs, or belonging, but in your essential nature. You discover that authentic selfhood is the only home that can't be taken from you. But you can only find that home after you've fully grieved the loss of collective belonging. Jung's final observation about awakened consciousness might be the most painful. You develop the ability to see people's authentic potential and simultaneously see their refusal to live it. You perceive who they could become and watch them choose who they've always been. And you can't unsee either reality. Once you've individuated toward your own authentic self, you develop what Jung called self-recognition, the ability to perceive the self in others. You can see beneath their persona, past their conditioning, through their defenses, straight to their essential nature. You see who they actually are beneath everything false. This would be beautiful, except you also see their resistance to becoming that. You watch them betray their authenticity, choose comfort over truth, perform personas instead of living from self. You see their potential and their refusal simultaneously. And it's heartbreaking. The experience is particularly painful because you can see exactly what they're avoiding and why. You understand that their refusal comes from terror of the psychological death that becoming their authentic self would require. You see that they're choosing known suffering over unknown liberation because the known, no matter how painful, feels safer than the unknown. Jung felt this acutely with humanity overall. He could see humanity's potential for consciousness, integration, individuation, but he also saw the collective's massive resistance to that development. He watched people choose war over shadow work, projection over integration, collective unconsciousness over individual awakening. The gap between what humans could become and what they were choosing to remain was, he said, sometimes unbearable to witness. This is why awakened people sometimes seem sad or disappointed. They're not judging humanity. They're grieving the gap between human potential and human choice. They see what's possible and watch most people refuse it. And that refusal isn't from stupidity, it's from terror. People sense that living their authentic potential would require psychological death of their current identity, and they choose known suffering over unknown transformation. But here's what Jung learned. You cannot awaken people who've chosen sleep. You cannot force individuation on those who refuse it. You cannot make people see their potential when they're committed to their limitations. The most you can do is become fully yourself and trust that your consciousness might give others permission to develop theirs when they're ready, if they're ready. This is the final loneliness of awakening. You see what almost no one else sees. You perceive potential that will mostly remain unlived. You understand truths that will mostly remain ignored. And you have to make peace with being one of the few who chose consciousness in a world where most people choose comfort. Let me bring these experiences together. You feel physically ill around unconscious energy because your system has become sensitive to psychic contamination. You see through social performances because your consciousness can recognize psychological mechanisms you once participated in unconsciously. Conversations feel unbearably shallow because you perceive multiple dimensions while others operate at single-layer awareness. You feel psychologically homeless because you've lost collective belonging without yet establishing individual ground. And you see everyone's potential alongside their refusal to live it. These aren't problems to fix. They're confirmation that your consciousness has expanded beyond collective norms. Jung would say, these experiences prove you're perceiving realities most people remain blind to. But here's what's crucial. These experiences aren't the destination. They're transition markers. You're between consciousness levels, past collective unconsciousness, not yet fully established in individuated consciousness. These experiences are the turbulence of that transition. As you continue developing, some will shift. The physical symptoms may remain, but you'll learn to manage them. The seeing through performances becomes less painful and more compassionate. The shallow conversations become opportunities for practice rather than torture. The homelessness eventually transforms into home in self, and the grief over others' refusal softens into acceptance. But right now, if you're having these experiences, Jung would want you to know you're not going crazy. You're becoming conscious, and consciousness sees what unconsciousness cannot. If you're experiencing these things, the physical symptoms, the seeing through, the unbearable shallowness, the homelessness, the grief over unlived potential, Jung would tell you, you've crossed a threshold most people never reach. Not because you're special, but because you were willing to pay the price of consciousness that most people refuse. These experiences are isolating because they're rare. Most people will never understand what you're going through, because their consciousness hasn't developed to the level where these perceptions become possible. But you're not alone in these experiences. Everyone who individuates reports them. Everyone who awakens goes through them. You're part of a small, scattered community of people perceiving realities that collective consciousness denies. Stop trying to make these experiences go away. They're not problems, they're perceptions. You're seeing what's actually there. The question isn't how to stop seeing. It's how to live with seeing clearly in a world committed to not seeing. Trust these experiences. They're confirmation you're on the path. They're proof your consciousness is developing beyond collective norms. They're evidence that you chose truth over comfort, consciousness over sleep, authentic becoming over false belonging. You're not crazy, you're awake, and awakeness perceives what sleep cannot. If you're experiencing these things that you can't explain to anyone, if you're navigating consciousness that feels impossibly lonely, if you're seeing realities others deny, subscribe to the channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.